I have a lot of spicy takes on tech hiring. It's kind of my thing, which is why I'm really excited that this article just got posted on, of all places, Haskell for All, called My Spiciest Take on Tech Hiring. I had to take the opportunity to read this quick, so really excited. This blog's awesome. I've read a few other things on it in the past. Definitely check it out if you haven't. Let's dive in to the author's spiciest take on tech hiring. My spiciest take on tech hiring is that you only need to administer one technical interview and one non-technical interview, each more than 1 hour long. Interesting, especially with the current discourse. I saw a lot of people complaining earlier about how many technical interviews it takes to get the job. Like being rejected on the 7th interview is the worst thing ever and reasonably gets people upset. But the idea of just 2 interviews, especially with each one being only an hour, that's interesting. In my opinion, any interview process longer than that is not only unnecessary, but it's actually counterproductive. Obviously, this streamlined interview process is easier and less time-consuming to administer, but there are other benefits that might not be obvious. I have so many thoughts already, but I want to better understand their perspective before I get too in the weeds here. The first major point they have is more effective interviews. When everyone is responsible, no one is responsible. Interesting. This is a link to Wikipedia, Diffusion of Responsibility. It's a socio-psychological phenomena whereby a person is less likely to take responsibility for actions or inactions when other bystanders or witnesses are present. This is actually a really common thing for like emergency response. Like, oh, it's literally the example here. Yeah, this is hilarious. The example here, one that I've encountered in my past, is when you're in an emergency, like let's say somebody isn't breathing and you're trying to administer CPR. You can't be administering CPR and calling for emergency services at the same time. So it's intuitive to be like doing that work and then shout, somebody call 911 or whatever. The difference here is that if you say someone do it, since there's multiple people, the responsibility has been diffused across the group. So no one person feels responsible. The thing that's important here is to make sure you call out a specific person. So instead of saying someone call for help, point at one person and say you call for help, because you are reducing the responsibility scope to one individual. If 5 people hear it, they'll all be like, oh, I'm sure someone else will. But if you point at one and say you do it, they feel solely responsible for it. So I find it very amusing they actually call that example out in here. Very real problem. And I definitely see that in interviews too, where especially like at Amazon and Twitch, they have a system called the 1 to 4 system, where you rate a candidate 1 to 4. I need to Excel draw this. Amazon interview ranking. So when you're interviewing at Amazon, there are 4 different scores you can get. 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'll start with 2 and 3 because I think these are the most easy to understand. 2 is probably shouldn't hire. And 3 is probably should hire. So the hireability line is between 2 and 3. So if there's a candidate that you're not sure about, if you're like, I don't know how I feel about this person, I'd be fine either way. There's no result for that. There's no option. And that's by design because everybody would just pick the middle option. But by not providing one, you're forced to go over or under this line. And to say what 1 and 4 are, 1 is I would quit if you hire them. And 4 is I would quit if you don't hire them. I like this scoring system a lot when you have multiple people doing an interview because it gets everybody to show how they really feel. If there's a candidate with a bunch of 2s and then 1 4, that says a lot about the processes that these people went through and means we need to have a conversation. Why did everybody lean no except for this one person who thinks they're a great hire? Where is that difference coming from? Or if a bunch of people do 3s and then one person gives a 1, I'm guilty of this. I've been the person who gives a 1 on a candidate that otherwise got 3s. My 1 overrode like 4 people giving them a 3 because I was saying this person is not good enough to work on this team. The others were like, yeah, they'd be a fine addition. And then we could have the conversation of why I had these strong concerns and we were able to not hire the person. But I think it's important to have a system like this so that you can have, first off, nobody saying neutral, but also people with strong feelings either way, expressing those with a number so that we can then have the conversation before making the decision. But the decision is the average score over 2.5. The decision is we look at the numbers everyone gave people, and then we have a conversation based on that. And I was actually well known for being one of the few people who would regularly give 1s and 4s because I had a strong interview process and I felt pretty confident by the end of the interview whether or not this person made sense and was often able to tie break or push candidates either direction because I had a different process than others did. But I actually do like this scoring system. And I think something like this is necessary if you're a team. But we're not talking about teams here. We're talking about the distribution of responsibility, which again, here, by doing numbers like this, you have the two options in the middle that are the like, I don't want to take too much responsibility. This is my general vibe. And then the top and bottom, which is I'm taking ownership here. I do or don't think this candidate makes sense. And that's another way to think of this, is taking stronger ownership of your decisions. Back to the article, though, because I have a lot of thoughts. Interviewers are much more careful to ask the right questions when they understand that nobody else will be administering a similar interview. They have to make the questions count because they can't fall back on someone else to fill the gap if they fail to gather enough info to make a decision on the candidate. Adding more technical or non-technical interviews makes you less likely to gather the information you need because nobody bears ultimate responsibility for gathering decisive information. Yep, I like this a lot. And I will say the non-technical thing is also something that comes up in here. We've had candidates that got a whole bunch of 3s from the engineers, and then the HR person or whoever went to lunch with them gave them a 1. I had one really interesting candidate that slaughtered on the take-home like programming challenge, and they showed up to their interview an hour and a half late, clearly very hungover, seemingly still a little bit drunk, honestly. They confessed to another one of the interviewers they had just gotten back from Vegas and flew from Vegas straight to SF to do an interview at Twitch. So despite the fact that their technical interviews they had done prior were in the 3 to 4 range, obviously we couldn't hire that candidate. But the fact that a non-technical person could have given them a 1 for that when everybody else gave them 3s and maybe even 4s enabled the conversation. That's a 4, absolutely hire them. I love you guys. Yeah, you get the point though. The one technical and non-technical interview means that you need to know those two are really good. So it puts way more responsibility on the person giving those interviews. But I can say confidently, I would have made bad hiring decisions at Twitch if I was the only interview that mattered. I had plenty of times where I was like, yeah, this person seems pretty good. And then somebody else brought something up and I was like, oh, fuck, that's bad. So having, at the very least, I think these two interviews should be different people just to get different vibes. And I'm going to go more into like the importance of an interview process as we go through, but I want to keep chatting through, or I want to keep going through this first. Better senior applicants. I think I know where this one's going, and I have a feeling I'm going to agree. When hiring for very senior roles, the best applicants have a lower tolerance for long and drawn out interview processes. Yep, I almost certainly knew this. I actually, on the other side, as a candidate for jobs, pushed this really hard. My resume, I haven't updated it for a while. I probably should just to have it as an example. If we go to my T3GG repo, I have my resume here. It is a markdown file. This is my resume. I used to have a fancy LaTeX resume. I used to have a fancy PDF I did in Photoshop because I hated Illustrator and InDesign, but I don't care anymore. I don't want to have to perfectly cater this weird process around like having my PDF get AI analyzed in order to figure out which part of the pile for candidates I should be in. I hate that shit. I don't want anything to do with it. And I like to think I'm a decent engineer, especially at the time when I had just moved from Twitch to building a whole platform from scratch for TTFM. I knew my shit. I was a good engineer. I was very hireable. I didn't actually know what level I was at because I had been fucked so many times around my level. I was originally interviewing for senior roles and quickly realized I was closer to like principal staff when I started talking to these companies and realizing what they needed and what I could provide. But there was a lot of companies that wouldn't take a markdown file. One of the ones I was really interested in would only take PDFs and doc files, like a Word file for your resume. There was about 5 or 6 companies that did that, and most of them I didn't apply to at all. One of them, I made a PDF, and the PDF was just a URL to go to my resume on GitHub because I was not going to put this extra work in for this specific company's specific process. I just don't care. I can get an offer that better fits my expectations and needs by exploring those in my own time, in my own way. I can find places that are accepting of a markdown resume. Why would I want to work somewhere that doesn't? It's not just they're losing out on me. I think of it the other way, which is if this company will never hire somebody whose resume is markdown, there's a lot of great engineers I would want to work with that would never work there. Because a lot of the engineers I want to work with aren't going to go through this whole stupid process. They're going to make the thing that works for them, like a markdown resume, and submit that. So could I have made a decent PDF quickly for them and gotten the job and been a happy employee of that place? Perhaps. But the thing they did that I let filter me, I let it filter me because I knew it would filter other people as well. And if people I want to work with wouldn't pass the filter, then I don't want to work there. If you have a filter that makes it so great candidates just don't feel like dealing with you, then I don't want to work there because the other great candidates I could potentially be working with all failed your interview process because you have these weird things in it. Great engineers aren't going to sit through 7 interviews. They're going to get annoyed by the 3rd one and stop. And making sure your interview process doesn't filter out the best people is a really important thing when you're doing these types of interviews. And I find most interview processes have so many weird things in them, especially for big companies, that the best engineers just get tired of it and give up. And that's a huge advantage you have as an earlier stage company or a small team. Also a thing I think Amazon does really well, where every team at Amazon kind of runs their own interview process. There are suggestions and guidelines in like an interview class you take before you start doing them. But for the most part, you can ignore all of that. And as long as you use their score system, they don't care what you do. And I think that's great because the teams that are interviewing for people on their team can make their process work best for the types of people they want to hire. But that's a really important piece here, is that the best candidates, the most senior candidates, the ones who have the best experience and potentially the best fit for your team, if you make it too hard for them to go through the process, they're just not going to go through it. The financial security point that Deal made here is important, but my take on that is that if you're willing to take a job that you wouldn't have otherwise with people that you wouldn't want to work with otherwise just for the money, you're a flight risk to that company. Because as soon as a company that is a better fit for you offers you even the same amount of money, not even more, you're going to immediately bail and go there. So while you might be more willing to put up with these things, the company that you're working for will be a worse fit. Because if they're doing things in the interview that make you not want to work there, they're going to be doing those things on the job as well, because all the people who went through that interview now work there and now make those decisions. The types of people who go through 7 interviews and are like, yeah, that's totally normal and fine, they're the ones who are now running the interview process because they went through it, they think it's fine, they work there, now they run the teams, now they run the interviews, now they run all these things. That creates a culture. And if that's a culture you don't want to be part of, that's not just fine, it's probably good. And if you're a valuable enough candidate that you're watching videos like this on my channel, you probably know well enough that this interview process sucks. That's why I already brought this up on stream earlier. I have this video where I interviewed Dan Abramov with a mock job interview. And I made a Notion doc that I send to all of my interview candidates when they're about to do a technical, a custom version of it, obviously, where I present them different options on how to showcase their abilities to their best ability. Because I want them to feel like they're in an environment where they can succeed. That's how my companies work. That's how my teams work. I really want to allow developers to feel comfortable in control and like they understand what they're about to do. And by giving them those things, giving them those options, I guarantee basically every candidate can have some more confidence going into the interview. And a lot of these options, especially the last two, the bring your own repo or bring your own interview plan, these exist both because they give candidates more confidence because there's more things they can pick from, even if they never pick them, but also on the rare chance they think they have a better way to showcase their abilities than I do, they can just tell me and we can do that instead. Because I want my candidates to be as successful as possible in the process, because I want my engineers to be as successful as possible in their contributions. My interview process is structured around that. So if there's a candidate that doesn't fit my current interview process, there's an escape hatch right there for them to propose something different. Because I want the best engineers, not the ones who best fit my existing process. Back to this article, though, because there's some good points here I want to riff on more. I like this more than I expected. A lot of companies think that dragging out the interview process helps improve candidate quality. What they're actually doing is inadvertently selecting for more desperate candidates that have a higher tolerance for bullshit in process. Yep. This kind of touches on what Deal was saying earlier with the financial security. If you're less financially secure, you're more desperate. And desperate candidates are not the ones you want to hire. The only good type of desperation is desperation to do something exciting. Like they're desperate to work for Figma because what Figma is doing speaks to them. Not they're desperate to get a job because they need money. They're desperate to be at this specific place because it is exciting to them. That can be okay. But ideally, desperation is not the thing you're basing your hiring process around. That's why a lot of the layoffs are currently happening. People were so desperate to fill seats, they lowered their bar too much. Yeah, great point here. Is this actually the kind of engineer that you want to attract as you grow your organization? Absolutely not. And it's far too common. So when asked about my thoughts on take-home tests, I think they're a good option. I think for candidates that prefer that, it could be really useful. But for candidates that see that, like some candidates will see that as unnecessary work in their free time. Others will see it as a great, exciting way to play with new technologies and showcase what they're building. I personally, as a candidate, quite liked doing take-homes. As a hiring manager, I find them to be a good bit amount of like work to do in a way that they're not like leaking, people are stealing code and shit, and actually reviewing them can be much more challenging than doing an in-person interview. But I'll cave and do a take-home test if the candidate really wants it. So again, it's building these things around what the candidates want, because ideally you're building your company around what your teams want and need to succeed. Because if you have a team that's success metrics aren't aligned with your company's, you should just get rid of the team. They don't fit your business. But if you have teams that are aligned with your business, then you need to do everything in your power to empower the people on those teams. And that starts with the interview. Priors and bias. In my experience, people tend to make up their minds on candidates fairly early on in the interview process, or sometimes even before the interview process begins. I am so guilty of this. I was like the only interviewer that would go out of their way to like read the candidates' GitHubs ahead of time. And the amount of times I saw horrifying things from candidates that we otherwise thought were good, like there was one candidate that was coming in as a React engineer that had been doing a bunch of leak code to level up their leak code skills. The 3 technical interviews before mine were leak code problems. In 2 of the 3, they did okay on. The 3rd one, they bombed. Fine, whatever. I gave them a React problem because they listed 2 years of React experience on their resume. I can say with 100% confidence this developer has never worked in React before. I had checked their GitHub before, but I didn't dig into the code enough. But when I did afterwards, I went to their GitHub. I went to their website for their homepage that was built in React. I shit you not, their portfolio, their React site was a single app.jsx file that had a giant HTML document pasted in the single return for that app class component. That was the entirety of their website, was just a bad HTML file embedded inside of a gigantic React like class component. It was insane. It was like 1,000+ line file. I've never seen anything like it. And I realized, oh, this candidate put React on their resume so they could get a job, not because they understand React, and immediately won out of 4 of them. I also gave them a bunch of useful feedback saying, hey, you don't actually know React. That's fine. You're still young and early, and this was an interview for like a role for an internship. But you should go learn these skills, go build things with this that better fit it. Here's the new React docs that just came out. You should go through these. They're great. And they ended up hitting me up afterwards, thanking me a whole bunch. And I think I've given them some feedback even since, like 4+ years later. That's another thing that they're not touching on enough here. Please give your candidates feedback. I get that it's so much work and it's scary and has potential legal liabilities and all these things. I don't fucking care. Find a way to do it. It builds not just good faith, and it's not just the right thing to do. It can build relationships that last way longer. Some of my closest friends are people who I interviewed with. Either I interviewed them or they interviewed me, where things ultimately didn't work out. And we kept chatting afterwards. I don't know if I've shared this before. I interviewed at Railway before I started Ping. And a big part of why I started Ping was when I was talking with the founder at Railway, who had concluded they wanted me to work there and given me an offer. He was very transparent in that. He saw me more as a founder. And while they wanted that type of energy, I was so excited with what I was doing with Ping at the time that he thought that might be the better path and recommended that I, at the very least, consider exploring that option a little more deeply before I commit to working at a job like Railway. Since then, I've been lucky to call Jake a good friend. We chat about all of these things all the time. I've obviously went from just being a random shit poster on Twitter to a somewhat relevant figure in the space. But even though this interview ended up not being a job for me, it ended up being a great relationship that we had. Another one that didn't work out is I was interviewing at Retool and I actually didn't get the job just because we had differences in opinion on some things. My roommate, Mark, I recommended he take that opportunity a little more seriously because there were some roles there that I thought fit him well. He ended up working there like 2 weeks later and being a huge part of their whole support engineering department and then moving over to contributing to the front end and the code base as a whole. And then I stole him to my CTO. Those things happen because we had a good conversation and experience. Even if I didn't get an offer, I still had a good vibe with the company and I would recommend them to others. Those things only happen if you have these conversations with people. Back to this post though, because this is triggering some of my favorite rants. The shorter interview process formalizes the existence of that informal phenomena. Yeah, the phenomena being that you know ahead of time who you actually want to hire. If you make the interview process shorter, it becomes even easier to notice that. Especially at a larger tech company, the hiring manager already has a strong prior on a few applicants. Either the applicant is someone that they or a team member referred, or they have a strong portfolio. This is such a realistic post. I've tried to talk about these things. I have a video on my third channel where I rant about this a bit more. But the fact that like so many people are laid off right now means that everyone has a friend that they've worked on code stuff with. Okay, slight correction. Every employed engineer has at least one friend that is a good developer they've worked with before that is looking for a job right now. Every fucking single one of us does. I can name like 3 or 4 off the top of my head, and I don't even do that anymore. Obviously, I have hundreds more from my community, but just ex-coworkers that have been laid off or are in weird places because of the state of the industry. I know so many people that if I had a role, I would hire instantly. And if I help other companies hire, which I do a lot, I can refer the people who I've worked with more easily. This is first off a reason to be really collaborative and involved and nice to work with at your job, because if other things happen in the future, be it one of the people on your team goes somewhere else or layoffs occur or any of these things happen, just by having these relationships with others, you're so much more likely to be in the network and in the know about all these opportunities. But also, when you're trying to hire yourself, when you're trying to build up your team. Hiring on trust is the most important thing. I talk about this a lot, especially in that third channel vid. Hiring is trust-based. And the more trust you can have with a person, the more likely you are to get that role. And if I have a candidate that has all of these awesome things on their resume and they slaughtered the interview, but all of my trust came from those things, I don't have any prior with them. Or I have a candidate that might not have done quite as well in the interview, but I've worked with them before and I know that they can make shit happen. Maybe not as fast that other candidate might, but I know that this person is capable. I'm going to hire them every single time. So how good your resume is and how good your portfolio is and how well you do in the interview even now matters a lot less if I know 5 people looking for a role and all 5 would be a good fit for the role I'm hiring for. So the best opportunities are still the people who have the most experience and knowledge. Like if I have been working in this industry for years and I'm hiring, I like to think my teams are cool to work on. I would imagine a lot of others agree. I've seen enough people begging to work for me at this point that we had to make a website making fun of it. Hiring.ping.gg, because we're not hiring. I hire when I feel like I have to because somebody's being too useful, not because we have an open role that needs to be filled. That all said, the people who are working on the coolest things and have the coolest opportunities, like what I'm building, like all the cool teams and companies that we all aspire to work for, the people who run those opportunities and make the decisions around those hiring processes, those are some of the most connected people in the industry. They have so many friends and so much experience. And now, more than ever, those people are looking for new jobs. So previously, I might have had to go and hire from a pool of candidates I wasn't familiar with because everybody I knew already was happy with their role. Now that people are less happy and also getting laid off and aren't getting raises anymore and are stuck dealing with a bunch of maintenance bullshit because the 3 teams around them got laid off, great engineers are looking for jobs more often now. Great engineers know great engineers. That combination means I can hire people I know and already have trust in. The trust debt that existed in the hiring process is kind of solved by the layoffs because now I know so many people who I already trust that I can hire from. The risk is way lower, as Cream Payne just said, and the confidence is much higher. The risk and the confidence, those are the 2 key things you're balancing in your interview process. And if you can hire somebody based on your prior knowledge that they're a good candidate, that is so much easier and so much higher confidence and so much lower risk than hiring somebody fresh out of college or a boot camp or somebody who has worked on solo projects for 5 years and isn't really involved in the community. That's the key here. So many candidates expect to just get a job because they have a really cool resume. The person who knows more people will always win on top of you, especially for the cool opportunities. If you want a cool job, you have to know cool people. You can't get a cool job by Hail Marrying your resume into a random company. The cool jobs come from the cool technologies and solutions and networks and relationships that you build outside of work and also inside of work. But if you don't know cool people working on cool things, you're not going to get a cool job working on cool things. That's just a fact right now. To go back to the article, though, as they said here, the applicant being a person that the hiring manager or a team member referred makes them a much higher likelihood to get hired. But also, they have a strong bias to hire those applicants they already know before the interview process began. Drawing out the interview process is a thinly veiled attempt to launder this bias with a neutral process they will likely disregard or overrule if it contradicts their personal preference. As I was saying earlier, I don't actually give out this interview guide very often, especially now. Because the people who I'm hiring, I already know they're good. I've seen it in so many places. Somebody like our superstar engineer, Giuliano, I knew I could hire Julius because he kind of took over Create T3 app and also made Create T3 Turbo, which is the best starting point for modern mono repos in TypeScript. These 2 projects made it very, very clear Julius knew what the fuck he was doing. And then he got brought into TRPC by Alex because Alex saw what he was doing and was like, yo, you clearly know what you're doing. Can you help us out with this? And now he's become one of the lead contributors to TRPC as well. So now we brought him in and now he's being paid to work on Upload Thing. But that's because he was in these spaces making useful contributions that were highly visible. Everything that happened there just kind of made sense. And those are the people who I hire from now. And the thought of giving Julius a technical interview, sending him a problem like a take home or like doing a 2-hour call where he has to like code through something live with me, it just feels dirty. I don't need to know that from him. He has proven to me that he can deliver great software. No way I could ever question that. Make him reverse a linked list just in case. Yeah, this is the problem though. If a candidate is good enough, and I know that ahead of time, which I'm in a privileged position to know a lot of great candidates before ever needing to interview them, I might never give a technical interview again. That's a weird thought, but the people who I am hiring have already proven their technical capabilities. The idea of giving them 7 technical interviews just to make sure that it's a fair process is fucking stupid. Back to the article. This doesn't mean I think this sort of interviewing bias is good or acceptable, but I also don't think drawing out the interview process corrects for the bias either. If anything, extending the interview process makes it more biased because you're selecting for candidates that can take significant time off from their normal schedules to participate in an extended interview panel, which are typically candidates from privileged backgrounds. Yep. Very much agree. This is actually one of the things that has pushed me so hard on being like pro Medicare for all. It's two things. The first thing is that when I was a 25-year-old running a company, should not have been responsible for the healthcare of multiple people and their families. That shit sucked. And figuring it out right was a massive risk. And I'm thankful I did, but I fucked it up a bunch in the process. And I could have had like one of our employees who was diabetic. They might not have been able to get their insulin if I fucked this up. That's insane. And the fact that I, as a 25-year-old, was responsible for people in their fucking 30s getting the medicine for themselves and their kids is just, what the fuck? How do we get there? The other thing that made me go particularly ballistic on this was realizing I had enough money to chill and like do interviews with other places, but getting my healthcare sorted was a mess because in America, we usually get our healthcare from our employers. So if I wanted to do like a 3-week trial at a company to see if it was a good fit, and if it wasn't, go work somewhere else, I would have no healthcare for that time unless I went to the private market and bought it myself, which is basically impossible to do. It was so obnoxious. I spent weeks trying to figure it out. And eventually, one of the biggest things driving me towards incorporating my business was so I could give myself healthcare. That's insane. The fact that my health insurance is a meaningful driver in how our interview processes work is just unbelievable. It's like, I'm a big fan of free markets. That's not a free market. We're tied to our jobs because our healthcare is tied to them as well. That is pathetic. And with things like really long interview processes, work trials, all these things, you have to be in a massive position of privilege to not have to worry about things like your healthcare. And it's just insane that that's the case. So I wanted to go on a quick tangent about that, but yeah, you get the idea. Interview processes that are really long mean only certain people can do them. And if you don't have the ability to take the time off from work, you can't do it. And if you don't have a job, you can't either because you're grinding to like get your life together. It's just insane. Like if we all had healthcare external from our jobs, if we all had the ability to take some time off from work and go work somewhere else, these things would make these processes a little more fair, but dragging the interview out for 7 interviews does not. I'm going to go on one last tangent about this part because it's something I haven't had a chance to yet. I mentioned it earlier. The one benefit of these long interviews is that as long as you're interviewing with different people every time, and also each of those people is somebody who will be on your team, you can get a much better idea of the team fit. And that's one of the most important things in the interview process, especially if you already know that they're technically capable and somebody on the team has worked with them in the past. It's so important to figure out how well they fit the rest of the team. And if the interview, it could even be like 4 people going to lunch together with the candidate, just seeing how you vibe and chatting with them. That I love. But you need to know because like this person's going to be on your team. So if you interview with like one group of people and then work for another, that's the worst. I fucking hate it. I can't believe Facebook still does that. It's like the worst thing about the Facebook like engineering culture is that you don't interview with the people you work with. Amazon's really good about this, minus internships. But for the actual jobs at Amazon, you're interviewing with the people you're going to be working with and on the team you're going to be working on. Doing a more personal process to make sure that the people on the team feel like this person is a good fit, not technically, not skill, not any of that, just that we vibe is really important, especially for a loud asshole like myself. Knowing that I can disagree with people is important. Something I'll actually look for in my interview process is finding something I disagree on with the candidate and then seeing how we can disagree. So important, so much more so than any ability to write a good React component is how well we can have a back and forth. When we don't agree on something, what does that look like? And if we can figure that out in the interview process, that's great. Entirely separate from how long the interview process is, but it's an important detail. And I find that the desire to have them talk to everyone on the team is often a driver for these really, really long interview processes. Or something I've also seen is you're talking with one team, you interview with 3 people there, they're like, this candidate's good, but they're not a good fit for us. And they send you to another team that does another 4 interviews with you. I've seen this happen so often. But you can work around this by structuring your interviews in a more like group or casual setting. If you can just sit down with lunch with the candidate and a few other people that are on the team, that's a much better vibe. And making sure the vibes are right is one of the most important parts of the interview process. That it can't be measured, it can't be put into a process. You just have to do it. And I find that if we're talking about the length of the interviews and not the vibe, that we might be missing one of those really important key points. Anyways, I want to read about Gabriella Gonzalez's background. The inspiration for this take is my experience as a hiring manager at my former job. We started out with a longer interview process for full-time applicants and a much shorter interview process for interns, one technical and one non-technical. The original rationale behind this was that interns were considered lower stakes hires because they're not going to be there that long. It's a much less risky thing to hire for. So the interview process for them didn't need to be as rigorous. However, we found that the interview process for interns was actually selecting for exceptional candidates despite what seemed to be a lower standard. So we thought, why not try this for all of our hires and not just interns? We didn't make the transition all at once. We gradually eased into it by slowly shaving off one interview from our interview panel with each new opening till we got it down to one technical and one non-technical interview. In the process of doing so, we realized with each simplification that we didn't actually need these extra interviews after all. Yeah, I dig that. I dig that a lot. This is, Gabriel, why did you think I wouldn't like this? Because another Gabriella wrote it? This is a great article. I have a lot of opinions. I hope this is useful to those of you who are hiring or who are looking for jobs. Huge shout out to Gabriella for writing this awesome article. I'm really pumped with this one. It's nice having somebody solidify these thoughts and wrap in actual experience. Most of the hiring takes I've seen have been about the candidate and the candidate experience, not the perspective of the hiring manager and interweaving them this way. One of the better articles I've read this year without question, and huge shout out to her for writing it. This process sucks, and the entire interview process largely needs to be rethought. And the companies that figure these things out early are going to have a massive advantage. So if you're a hiring manager looking to grow your teams, pay close attention to this. It's really important feedback and useful information to hire great people. And on the other hand, if you're a candidate, don't feel like you have to comply to these miserable processes. If you don't want to work at the type of place full of engineers that were happy to go through 7-10 interviews, then don't. But you can put your foot down in interviews. It's okay to intentionally fail an interview if it means you'll end up somewhere that's a better fit. Let me know what you guys think. Shout out to Gabriella. Until next time, peace nerds.